thank you everyone for joining us, and welcome to our series, Urgent and Emerging Topics for Academic Integrity. Thank you to the Taylor Institute for hosting this series, and to all of the staff at the Taylor Institute for making this series possible. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Kita Gladue, who will be talking with us about Indigenous academic integrity. And for the benefit of everyone who is here, just a reminder to let you know that your participant microphones will be muted during the webinar. I will be monitoring the chat, and then I will be sharing those questions with Kita. And just to let everyone here know, Kita's audio is not working, so she won't be able to hear questions. I have her on the phone. So we're going to use multiple technologies to ensure that our session moves ahead today. So please use the chat box for question. Our webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with all of the participants within about a week of today's live session. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Kita. Kita, go ahead and take it away.
Welcome. This is a recording of the presentation, Indigenous Academic Integrity, Relationships, Stories, and Reciprocity. My name is Kita Gladue, and I'll be spending the rest of the presentation with you. I am a graduate student in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary, and I also serve my community as the Indigenous Student Program Advisor for the University of Calgary in Writing Symbols Lodge, which is the Indigenous Student Support Center at the University of Calgary. I'm grateful for the opportunity to spend this time with you, and I welcome you to experience this presentation in a good way. I invite you to come forward and lean into the narrative approach that I'm going to bring to this presentation. I'm going to be using visual and oral storytelling as a means of parallel practice and indigenizing my own work. So please enjoy. First, let's go over some of the learning outcomes. We are going to look at identifying specific themes and principles of Indigenous paradigms. We are going to gain insight and examples of Indigenous paradigms in practice. We are going to demonstrate concrete knowledge and understanding of the difference between decolonization and indigenization, both critical movements within the academic sphere, but they're two different and distinct ideas. First, let me introduce myself in a more fulsome way. Coming from an Indigenous collectivist understanding of the world, who I am is who I come from. These are members of my family. My grandmother, who was a member of the Sucker Creek Cree Nation in Treaty 8, and my grandfather, who was a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and his side of the family traces its roots back to the Red River Valley settlement. My parents, my brothers, this is the heart of who I am. But it is not the end of the connections that make me who I am. Beyond the nuclear, collectivist understandings make space for deeper and wider expressions of family and community. And who I am is also who I am connected to. These are my cousins. These are my mentors, the elders that I've worked with. These are the peers that I've had, the people who helped raise me, and the people who changed the way that I work. I am who I am connected to, and it is with the honoring of them and the gratitude for all that they have shared with me that I start my presentation. And Indigenous peoples also recognize that who we are as Indigenous peoples is also where we come from, the land that we come from, the place that we come from. For me, I was raised on the unceded traditional territories of the Ahatisat Nation on Vancouver Island. The Ahatisat are one of the 14 nations that make up the New Chantlith. I was raised on a small island that's traditional name was Tile-Maksu, which I know I'm not pronouncing correctly, but I am trying. The common name for this place is now Esperanza. It is a small island, and it was a unique way of growing up. When I say that who I am is where I come from, I am expressing that there is knowledge that is unique to where I came from and where you come from. I grew up on an island. I took a boat to school every day. I know how to park a boat. I know how to navigate the fog on a morning on the ocean. I know what to do in the case of a tsunami. This is knowledge that the land and the water has given me. Take a moment to think about some of the things that where you come from have impacted who you are and the experiences that you have. For example, if you are in Calgary, where I'm currently living, then maybe you understand a little bit better about how to navigate black ice. However, folks in Vancouver, while they may not have the skills always to navigate black ice, they also know what to do in cases of hydroplaning. These are small examples of the birth and width of amazing information and experience that the land gives us. The land also has complex human relationships with it. So let's talk about where I am currently located. Folks, you may never have seen a map like this, but I invite you to take a look. This is a map of what is now called Canada. And articulated on this map are the post-Confederate or numbered treaties. There are 11 numbered treaties in Canada. The first was signed in 1871, the last in 1921. They are numbered sequentially. So if you're where I am, in Calgary, it was the 7th treaty signed between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples. Also note that a significant amount of Canadian land is not covered under treaty. This makes things complicated. Indigenous peoples have rights, internationally recognized rights. And this is part of the reason why there's a complex relationship between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. Let's dig a little deeper. As I said, I'm currently located in Alberta. So let's take a look at some of the complex relationships with the land that exist here. As you may know, in Alberta, there are 3 different territories or treaties regions that are articulated. Treaty 8, where my grandmother comes from, Treaty 6 in central Alberta, and Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. But there's more. In addition to this, there's also Métis regions here in Alberta. There are 6 Métis regions in Alberta that make up the Métis Nation of Alberta. But wait, there's more. In addition, Alberta is one of the only places in Canada that has settlements. These are specific land bases that are communities for Métis individuals and families. There are 8 in Alberta. And so you can see the complex relationship with the land and our relationship to it and how many layers it can have. So let's zoom in again into Treaty 7. So here is where I would like to acknowledge that I am living, working, and learning in the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, the signatories of Treaty 7 on the Indigenous side. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, which in Canada is made up of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. This is also home to another of the signatories of Treaty 7, which is the Tsuut'ina, who are the Dene people, as well as towards the mountains, the Stoney Nakoda, and they have 3 communities as well, the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations. This area is now home, as I just articulated, to my cousins, the Métis in Region 3. By honoring and locating myself and my relationship with the land, I am providing context about the work that I do. Have a moment, look it up, and locate yourself. See if it adds context and nuance to your work. So let's pull way back. First, I recognize that Indigenous is a global term, and there are many Indigenous peoples. The working definition that I have that was given to me by one of the elders that I work with, Elder Carrie Moore, is that Indigenous peoples are peoples who are still on the land from which their knowledge comes, living in their tribal communities, their collectivist communities. I'll say that again. Indigenous peoples are peoples who are still on the land from where their knowledge comes from, living in tribal collectivist communities. So I do acknowledge that there are many, many different forms of indigeneity around the world. Maybe you are Indigenous. The thing that takes people farther from that land-based knowledge and from their tribal community living is colonization. And that has had long-term effects on all Indigenous peoples, no matter where you live. But again, I want to zoom in a little bit closer. And for the purposes of this presentation, when I use Indigenous, I mean the peoples of what is now referred to as North America. Now, to understand exactly how much history, how much knowledge, and how much information there is here in this land with Indigenous peoples in what is now called Canada and North America, I like to do a little bit of a history lesson. So we have records that show Indigenous peoples being in what is now called Canada for between 16,000 and 14,000 years. Yes, between 16 and 14,000 years. In fact, a community on the coast, they were able to direct archaeologists to a specific location. They told them where to dig and where they would find the remnants of one of the communities that that nation had. Archaeologists went to the place that they were told to go to, they dug, and they found the community of the nation. And when they looked at how old it was about 14,000 years old. That is oral history providing 14,000 years of knowledge, of location, of data. To put this in perspective, the end of the last ice age was only about 11,700 years ago. What about Stonehenge? Well, Stonehenge was created 5,000 years ago. And the pyramids of Giza, they are but a skip and a jump in time away, being built only 4,500 years ago. And so when you look at contact and the process of colonization, this represents an important but small piece of the history of Indigenous peoples. When you invite Indigenous peoples into spaces and places to share their knowledge, this is the depth and breadth of the knowledge that you are accessing. So this is where I would like to begin with. There is no single Indigenous culture, language, belief system, traditions, or way of knowing. You see, Indigenous peoples are unique and distinct communities, sovereign nations unto themselves. In my work, what I have sought is to find the themes, alignments, and parallels in the many different, distinct, and diverse ways that Indigenous peoples express integrity and academic or knowledge integrity. So there are themes in Indigenous paradigms, and this is some that I would like to share with you. First, Indigenous paradigms seek to understand relationships, the relationships between us, the relationships between us and nature. Indigenous paradigms recognize interconnectedness. We recognize that we are not isolated, but integrated with one another, with the cosmos and creation. And Indigenous paradigms recognize land-based knowledge. For thousands of years prior to colonization, leadership in Indigenous communities was based on the character of the land and the needs of the people in their traditional territories. Kenny and Fraser, 2012. So let's look at Indigenous paradigms from a theory basis. Starting in theory is always a good place to start. Then ontology becomes ways of being. And epistemology becomes your ways of knowing. How do you seek out knowledge? And your methodology becomes ways of connecting. And finally, your axiology becomes how. How do we work together in a good way? These theoretical frameworks are all within that paradigm of relationship, interconnectedness, and land-based knowledges. These are the overarching themes, and from these themes, we'll look at some of the principles. These principles of Indigenous paradigms that we're going to discuss today are relationality, reciprocity, and respect. First, relationality. Knowledge is relational. In Cree, the word for couch or sofa literally means somewhere where you sit. It's you plus your relationship to the thing. I have created icons to represent visual storytelling methodologies to represent these principles. And this is the first. Knowledge is relational. Relationality is an ontological approach in which relationships serve as the connective tissue of reality. Each of us serve as threads in this universal blanket, braided and woven together through our relationships with one another, with non-human relatives, creation, and the cosmos. These intertwined threads, braids of experience and knowledge, form Indigenous perspectives from which we construct our reality through the lens of relationship. Or more clearly, concisely, and simply, elegantly articulated, Sean Wilson says, relationships do not merely shape reality, they are reality. So what does it look like to use this relationality in practice? One of the things that Indigenous peoples have long used and continue to today is self-location, which I demonstrated earlier in this presentation. Indigenous peoples often name our relations and trace our knowledges back to the elders and community members who shared teachings, cultural practices, ceremonies, and stories with us. This practice also serves as self-location, allowing us to contextualize ourselves by nation, family, territory, and experience. This relational work reflects the rigor of Indigenous knowledge integrity. Sean Wilson says, how can I be held accountable to the relationships I have with these people if I do not name them? I have used Cree words provided by Cree language speakers to help dive into and create nuance in some of the concepts that we're referring to. I am a Cree learner and not a Cree speaker, so I will not attempt to speak the words, but I will dive into the definitions. This word means we work on something together, collectively. We move towards something with a purpose in mind as a collective. Another relationality practice is teaching tracing, which is connected to self-location, but goes specifically into the knowledge that we are looking to identify and refer to. Teaching tracing, or the validation of knowledge and stories. We name these relationships in order to recognize from whom and where the knowledge comes. This process can also validate the rights of the individual to use or share the knowledge or stories, provided that the community has granted permission to the individual to use the knowledge beyond their own learning. These relationships can include our connection to elders, ancestral and family knowledge, to language, societies, clans, and of course, our relationship with the land. Indigenous holistic theory is whole, ecological, cyclical, and relational. Here are some of the questions that Sean Wilson provides to help orient your work. What is my role? What are my obligations? Does this method, the way in which I am working, allow me to fulfill my obligations? And does this method support the creation of relationships? Again, relationship, interconnectedness, and land-based knowledges are all here and articulated, but this is a way to orient the work that we do. Wilson was specifically talking about research, but I believe that these questions help orient and change our perspectives about scholarship as well. So the next theme and principle of Indigenous paradigms that I want to discuss is reciprocity. So Indigenous knowledge extends beyond the environment. It has values and principles about human behavior and ethics, about relationships, about wellness, and leading a good life. Knowledge has beauty and can make the world beautiful if used in a good way. Linda Smith, 2012. This is the symbol for reciprocity that I have developed. Reciprocity shows how we each serve as a unique link in a chain of knowledge that reaches back into the past through the millennia and pushes forward into the future. Each person is responsible to their community for the knowledge that they receive as learners and eventually pass on as knowledge keepers. The survival of our communities is predicated on the knowledge of this interconnected knowledge cycle. And reciprocity is how we acknowledge, value, and honor the work of sharing knowledge, as well as those who strive to share that knowledge with us. So what can reciprocity look like in practice? Well, reciprocity, according to Lavelle, reciprocity extends beyond the immediate research participants in keeping with the decolonizing notion of Indigenous research frameworks. Reciprocity also includes the advancement of Indigenous ways of knowing. She then talks about a story in which an Indigenous graduate student shared with her how a faculty member discouraged her from using Indigenous research framework because it did not seem as valid in the academy. And she says, we need to give back to future Indigenous scholars by pushing forth the recognition of Indigenous knowledge in the academy and research by publishing Indigenous works. And that is Lavelle, 2009. What's key here is that we need to start with acknowledgement. We acknowledge the knowledge and where it comes from. We acknowledge where we received it. We acknowledge the nations that it comes from and the land that it comes from. We honor the work of those who caretake this knowledge through time. And we demonstrate value. This can be things like when traditional knowledge keepers share knowledge with us, we provide honoraria. This is not a gift. This is understanding that knowledge keepers have made this knowledge and the caretaking and sharing of it their work. It is their profession. They are experts. They are PhDs in traditional knowledge. And when we provide honoraria, we are valuing that correctly. We are honoring that knowledge, and we are acknowledging the work that it takes to caretake that knowledge. Dr. Michael Hart said, inherent in this commitment to the people is the understanding of the reciprocity of life and the accountability to one another. Reciprocity is interconnectedness. It is understanding that at every level, at ecological, at the theoretical, at the ontological, we are interconnected. And reciprocity is the way in which we move through the world, the universe in a good way. His, her, or their work passes through generations. That is, of course, the idea that, again, each of us are a link, and we hold our hand backwards and connect to the past through the millennia. And we also hold our hands out to become that link into the future. So what does reciprocity look like in practice? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the responsibilities of teaching and learning. In order to support the ongoing survival, success, and holistic wellness of our communities, each individual serves a role in the community. In each role, we are part of a link between the past and the future. We are all responsible to be learners, to support the ongoing knowledge of the community. We also continue to learn from the land and the water. As knowledge evolves and changes with the land, we are the ones that bring that new knowledge, that new information back to the community. As we are intended to be learners, we are also called to be teachers, knowledge keepers, language speakers, mentors to those who are learning to serve their own roles in the community. We are passing that knowledge to the next link in the weave of the community's past and future. The integrity of storytelling. Storytelling is a method of Indigenous caretaking which ensures the integrity, consistency, and longevity of land-based and community-developed knowledge. The survival of the community depends on the information being passed down between generations, which necessitates clear, unwavering transmission of this data with as little corruption or unintentional change as possible. Story and song systems were created to serve the purpose of caretaking and protecting this knowledge through the passage of time. The integrity of storytelling is paramount as we are caretaking 16,000 years of knowledge. To earn something for yourself, to articulate the part of the process of gathering information of Indigenous research protocol. This leads to our next principle. Respect. Nothing about us without us. Respect is how we bring together different communities, ways of knowing, doing, learning, and connecting to create new knowledge. It is through respect that we are able to connect and create new designs in the weave of relationality. Without respect or through disrespect, we break the ties that bind us, leaving holes in the blanket of the universe. So let's take a moment and step back into the dominant Western or individualistic identity question. The question that gets asked is, what are you? Folks will often introduce themselves, as I did at the beginning of this presentation, with their profession. There are so many categories, and we often interact in our relationships by finding out who belongs where. So the question is, what are you? And as soon as you discover what you are put together with your community. What you are equals where you belong. From an Indigenous perspective, we understand that there are different dimensions of the individual. From the Cree perspective in which I learn, there's spiritual dimensions, emotional, physical, and cognitive dimensions of the self, but that these dimensions exist in relationships between two people or between communities. So we know that there are holistic dimensions of wellness that we prioritize and seek balance for. But the difference here is, from an Indigenous perspective, every member of the community is necessary. Every member of the community serves the purposes of the survival and well-being of the whole, which means absolutely everyone is necessary and belongs. And if every person and their individual identities, experiences, talents, skills belong, the question then that Indigenous and collectivist communities prioritize is, what role are you going to serve in community? You belong to us, holistically and completely accepted. We want you, you are us. So what role are you going to serve? What is the part that you're going to play in this ongoing collective? And this brings me to the idea of respect, but not just any kind of respect. The respect where you think of someone highly without regard for yourself, a term for ethics. In 2009, the Assembly of First Nations published the Ethical Guide on Research in Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge. And they laid out some principles for how they wanted researchers to interact with Indigenous communities. I believe that these principles are things that go beyond research. They are things that are absolutely a part of academic integrity from an Indigenous perspective. And if you are a non-Indigenous person who is looking to, again, come into and learn and integrate Indigenous knowledges into your work, these are principles that are, I believe, very valuable. So first is ownership, control, access, and possession. This is where a First Nations community retains ownership and control over Aboriginal knowledge and its interpretation. A community will have full access to any documents or research that includes Aboriginal knowledge. Next, we have informed consent, wherein a First Nations community will be fully informed about the use and interpretation of its knowledge, as well as the frameworks and methodologies used prior to the collection and interpretation of the knowledge. The community, of course, may grant or withhold its consent for its knowledge being accessed, disseminated, or otherwise used. Partnership. Researchers, managers, and First Nations communities will work together in full partnership on research that involves Indigenous knowledge. And yes, academic integrity. This is where the AFN says researchers will respect Aboriginal knowledge and not claim Aboriginal knowledge as their own. Disclosure. Researchers will acknowledge and disclose the origin of any Aboriginal knowledge used or referred to in research. Researchers must disclose when an invention, result, or finding is based on Aboriginal knowledge. Equity and benefit sharing, where the benefit of any research, invention, or finding based on Aboriginal knowledge should be equitably shared with the First Nations community that provided the knowledge. Nothing about us without us. And finally, empowerment. Aboriginal knowledge should be accessed and used in ways that empower First Nations communities, and researchers should not seek to qualify Aboriginal knowledge or devalue its worth or the worth of its holders. This is what the community has asked for. This is what the community has set out as its primary boundaries on this kind of relationship. And if you have any opportunity to look into and research when these relationships have not been held equitably, when they have not been done with respect, you can see that there's a reason why Indigenous communities have hesitation in working with researchers and academics. Our bodies, our traditions, our stories have been used in research that was not meant to empower, to partner. It did not have informed consent. It was not done with respect. So we are trying to set out new boundaries, new partnerships, and new ways of working together. So I want to talk a little bit about decolonization and indigenization. First, indigenization can only be done by Indigenous peoples. I will say that again. Indigenization can only be done by Indigenous peoples. It is the work of Indigenous peoples to indigenize. But decolonization is the work of all people. If you want more of an understanding about the difference between indigenization and decolonization, here is the way that I consider it in my own work. Decolonization is the understanding that there are dominant systems that are used to create the world and culture around us. This includes the academy. This is a system where there is a hierarchy of knowledge, where the knowledge that is considered the most important or the most valid is a Western view of knowledge and the academy. Decolonizing is identifying this hierarchy and understanding that it's a false narrative, that the Western ideologies of knowledge building and the academy and scholarship and integrity are simply one way in a plethora of ways to approach knowledge and community and the sharing of data. Decolonization is the work of troubling and challenging the notions that there is one right and valid way to do things, and looking for ways to investigate how things like colonization, patriarchy, some of these ideas are able to be broken down in our work and in our spaces. Indigenization is the bringing forward of Indigenous ways of knowing as that alternative. So we can challenge and break down these systems of oppression and colonization. That's decolonization work. And then we can propose Indigenous ways and Indigenous alternatives. So for example, in this presentation, again, I use visual and oral storytelling to navigate through the spaces of my own work. These two intertwined provide a different way of approaching, particularly beyond just writing. In this section, I would like to honor what has already been expounded upon. I'm specifically using this word as my literature source review. It is my part of the teaching tracing that I set out in this particular presentation. So I would like to acknowledge the knowledge keepers that I work with and who have worked with me. Elder Reg Croshoe, Elder Rose Croshoe, Elder Daphne Good Eagle, Elder Kelly Good Eagle, and Elder Carrie Moore, who is another Cree and Métis elder that I work very closely with. I'd also like to acknowledge my mentors, Dr. Yvonne Portrait-Pratt, Dr. Sarah Eaton, and Dr. Ilian Ferrer, who have supported my work, who have provided guidance, and who have been the beacons of light as I try and navigate this world of academia. I would like to also acknowledge the mentors, specifically the mentors who allowed us to do the Cree speaking in this, the Cree language in this presentation, including Neil McLeod and Eric Wolfengray. This is the resource that I developed as a multimodal resource and gift on academic integrity from an Indigenous perspective. So I hope you enjoy. So this resource will be made available on the Taylor Institute website, and it is my gift. Again, this is dedicated to my cousins, not just my Cree and Métis cousins, but my Coast Salish, Haudenosaunee, Nuu-Chapmanlith, all of my Dene and Blackfoot cousins, all of my relations, all of my Indigenous scholars and fellow researchers, all of my community members, and every Indigenous student who is looking for ways to bring the best of themselves forward. Our ways are valid. Our knowledge expands millennia, and we have our own practices of rigor, validation, and academic integrity. The things that we can bring into the academy are valuable. And I offer this new way and the new framework of creating relationships based on principles of relationality, of respect and reciprocity, because we are in relations with one another. And it is through respect and reciprocity that we can ensure the integrity of our relationships. Because remember, who we are is who we come from, who we are connected to, and where we come from. I am not asking for inclusion or accommodation. That makes it seem like Indigenous peoples are somehow in need of extra support to bring our knowledges forward, and that's not the case. I'm looking for good relations. I'm looking for purposeful, respectful relationships where we can provide some of this extraordinary knowledge that comes from our ways of knowing, our ways of being, our land-based knowledge, and our community-developed knowledge. I am looking for the respect and reciprocity so that we can work together in a good way. Consider this knowledge biodiversity. It is important. It is necessary. And if you're ever looking for a group of scholars, a group of students and communities, well, let me tell you that Indigenous peoples, we put the gritty in integrity. We know how to do the work. We've been doing it for centuries and millennia. Thank you so much for your time. I highly suggest, if you haven't had the chance already, to look at some of the works of some key Indigenous scholars. Linda Twally-Smith in Decolonizing Methodologies. Sean Wilson in Research is Ceremony. The AFN Guide for the Ethical Research and Indigenous Traditions Knowledge Treatment. And Gregory Younging, Elements of Indigenous Style. These are all incredible places to start if you are an Indigenous scholar and you want to learn more. And of course, my references. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I am grateful for all of the work of my mentors, my knowledge keepers, my family, those who came before, and those who I am caretaking into the future. Thank you for this opportunity to live, learn, and work with you. Go in a good way, and miigwech.
Kida, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and your knowledge with us. I feel like every time I listen to you, I learn with you in ways that just blow my mind that I never did before. So I will capture the chat because you've got lots of kudos coming in that way. Thank you so much. We appreciate you and all that you bring to this work. So we do have a question come in. This one came into me privately, but Kida, I'm going to ask you anyway. And it was, how do you approach courses where you have diversity, immigrants, Indigenous people, etc.? So that's kind of a big question, but I wonder if you might have some insights.
Okay, so how do you approach classes in which there is diversity? Well, first of all, congratulations, because those are the kinds of classes that I want to be in. When it comes to approaching classes, I think doing some of that work of decolonizing expectations and the way that we set up classes would be valuable. What I mean by that is, are your approaches, the approaches that have been used in every other class that you've taken or taught, are they predicated on the idea that there is the Western way of knowing, which is the way things should be done, And then like alternatives of folks might try. If you trouble that notion, if you dig into it and go, what if this hierarchy is simply one way in a diverse ways of approaching learning, and you take the pressure off of both the students and the instructor by saying, all of these students bring knowledge. The intention is to work at this in a good way, to work towards a specific goal. Is it knowledge creation? Is it knowledge sharing? How can you change your approaches to incorporate the knowledges in the room, to identify that there are different ways of sharing knowledge? And I will, I can speak to some of the ways that I have heard about. So there's some incredible, there is a YouTube video, which I don't have the link for, but if you look up LandBased Knowledges and the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary, LandBased Knowledges, Workland School in YouTube, they have some courses that they've done that bring people onto the land, that have like relationship building is a part of the course. And they speak to the amount of knowledge that is shared in that process. And I think that is extraordinary. I also know of courses where instead of writing final papers, where things like grammar might be more of an issue, folks are allowed to record a summary of their knowledge and provide that to the instructors to evaluate. What have they learned? So your final project, I'm sorry, there is construction behind me that just started. One of the things though that you would have an opportunity to consider is then, if English language was something that was more difficult for folks, having the ability to provide something else, to provide an oral storytelling to a camera is a lot easier in some ways for some folks than trying to write a paper. And does it serve the purpose? This is always my question. I'm not interested in accommodation, but I am interested in, are we serving the purpose of this form? So if the purpose at the end of an exam or a final presentation or a final paper is for students to demonstrate their learning, why does it have to be a paper or an exam or a final presentation? Could it be an oration of their learning? And there are people who are proving in the classroom that that's possible. So to approach a diverse classroom, I would suggest you ask diverse teachers and learners about what approaches works, and try something, risk something. Why not? That's the best part of curiosity and knowledge creation. And if we can't be curious as instructors, how can we inspire curiosity in learners? I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Kita. We have questions that have come in both through the private chat and the public chat. So I'll ask them to you in the order in which they came in to me. So questions come in that you talked about pan-Indigenization, and how would you recommend that we, and by we, I think it means people of a settler background who work in higher education, consult with our local Indigenous groups and accept their concepts may not align with institutional or national concepts of Indigenization.
So how can you do consultation in community in a good way, knowing that what you're going to get in that consultation will not always align with the forms that you work with in other places? Is that correct, Sarah?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So this is tricky. This is about how do people who are speaking different languages come together and create something together? And like, that's the work, which I'm not negating the question. The question is important, and it's a part of what I'm actively studying. So one of the things that I have found is, again, how do we center the purpose? Because if you're looking for consultation that perfectly aligns with what you're already doing, what is your actual space for integrating new knowledge? How have you approached the work? Pardon me. I just don't have any water. It's not the Rona. Sorry, just making sure. So one of the things is if you're expecting to get answers that already fit into your questions, or are the answers you assume are going to answer the questions that you've asked, then you're actually looking at a feedback cycle of confirmation bias. But good consultation is done in the same way that I tried to outline in this presentation. It's built on relationship, reciprocity, and respect. And what do I mean by relationship? I mean that there should be ongoing work, not dipping in and dipping out, but ongoing work that is dedicated to good relations between yourself and whomever you're consulting with. Because the more you understand about the lens and approach that they're coming with, the better you are able to use that incredibly valuable information and knowledge that they can provide you. But it means investing in the work of understanding that you will be translating from one culture to another. And while both folks might be speaking English, when I talk about ethics, and my definition of ethics is thinking more highly of someone else than myself, that is far different than the kind of ethics that other folks might approach things with. So we're using the same words, but they mean fundamentally different things. I'll give you an example. Treaties are a place in which we are still actively trying to understand one another. Because for Indigenous communities, treaties are relationship-based. They are like a marriage. They're about two people coming together to plan the future. How will they support the children? How will they grow together? How will they change together? How will they support each other in sickness and in health? But the Western understanding of a treaty is often more of a contract, a prenup. Who gets the dog when it all goes wrong? Those fundamental differences can be bridged through that relationship making, through that understanding and that work of bridging. So if you want to do meaningful consultation work, either connect with folks who have relationships with communities that you can then work towards, or invest in building those relationships predicated on reciprocity and respect going into the future. It's the difference between cold calling someone on the telephone to do a poll and interviewing someone for 3 days about a topic. There is a depth and richness to the information that you're going to gather, and it's predicated on the resources you invest in it, in the relationship. I hope that helps.
I think it helps a lot. We've got a richness of questions here. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, and it's asking for advice from you on how to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into formal consultation process. And there's an additional comment that says, it seems a far more respectful way to approach communities.
So there has been a lot of work that has been done on how to approach communities. And there are examples of people who do it really well. I'm going to plug 2 resources. One is free and one is a little bit of money, but it all depends. So there is a MOOC, a massive online open course through the University of Alberta on Indigenous peoples of Canada. This is something that can give someone a lot of primary knowledge, some foundational perspectives and understanding to come from that you can then build out of. I would also humbly say that the University of Calgary has a program called the Indigenous Relations Training Program. I'm one of the instructors for that particular course. It's called the IRTP, or Indigenous Relations Training Course, and it's a 4-day course that brings in traditional knowledge keepers and myself and some other Indigenous scholars, as well as some non-Indigenous folks whose work is focused on liaising and consulting with Indigenous communities and things like industry or the academy or non-Indigenous organizations. So I'm always, when in doubt, go to your knowledge keepers. Who are the people who've been doing this well? I'm an Indigenous person who works with Indigenous communities, and the liaising I usually do is out to non-Indigenous communities and community members. So I might be on the other side of that. But when you incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into the formal consultation process, I think that it is the idea, take a step back from capitalism. Yes, I know it's difficult, particularly as we head into the holidays, but take a step back from the commodification of relationships and think about what it would be if you were entering into this community to serve a role. If you want to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing, try approaching something from a collectivist perspective. Not what am I trying to get from this process? What am I trying to contribute to community? Consultation, again, should not be, in my opinion, ever a natural resource extraction process. It should be a partnership, like the AFN and the ethics research guidelines state, a partnership. There should be equity and benefit sharing. There should be integrity in the knowledge and where it goes. There should be informed consent. There should be disclosure of the findings and what you do with that consultation. And it should be predicated on empowerment of both parties. So that's how I would start. Go to my knowledge keepers, go to the Indigenous communities who have already often and over again stated what they wanted and needed from non-Indigenous folks, and start there.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, couple more questions. This one you may have actually addressed it in the session, but it would be good to have a refresher. And it was asking you for any examples or resources of Indigenous data analysis methods.
All right, so data analysis. All right, we get into it now. So when it comes to data analysis, you've got your qualitative and you've got your quantitative, and there's definitely different ways to theme things. When it comes to Indigenous data analysis methods, I do believe that there's a couple texts that have been, that are on order for me, but are available on things like Indigenous research methodologies. There's a couple that are out that they're all very good that talk a little bit about this. For me, the data analysis comes back for me to that, how do we approach the data as serving its role in community? So what is the purpose? What is the question that we started with? What is the research question? And what is the purpose what is the answer? What's the impact supposed to do? So when we start theming and we start doing our analyses, the core should always come back to that. This is meant to serve a purpose. I don't know, I haven't come across research that was not intended to serve a purpose. There may be some out there, but when you centralize that, it is going to affect the way in which you form or the way that you analyze your results. This is a process that I'm currently working through myself as a qualitative researcher, and I have less information on what it looks like from a quantitative perspective, though I do know that there are Indigenous research methodologies that do look at quantitative data analysis. So I would suggest, talking to someone more informed about that side than I am. But when it comes to the qualitative data analysis, keep that key, that core being, what is this meant to serve? And I think that helps center the principles, the themes, the outcomes that you're going to receive.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I also put some of your references from your slides in the text chat for like some of Sean Wilson's work and a few others. So that may help folks who are interested in learning more about Indigenous research methodologies. So another question that's come in is about teaching. It says, how do you reconcile the Western requirements for graduation in courses with the decolonization one would go through when setting their teaching space? So I think this is actually about how do I decolonize my teaching, maybe?
So one of the questions that I ask to decolonize when I teach and in my work is, do we do this way because it is the only way? It's never the only way, but is it the only way? And the second question that I ask is, what is the core purpose again of this requirement? If it's grades, many things can be graded. Does it have to be a grade that is connected to a test? Is it a grade that has to be connected to a paper? One of the other ways that I decolonize the classroom is that I look for opportunities of teaching and learning with the learners. People come into the class with knowledges, and I know that from a teaching pedagogy, we often say that, but where are there opportunities for you to learn from your students? Like, when was the last time we gave space or time for a class to learn about some of the things that folks have? And also, what would happen if we had an exit interview with our students, not a survey, but an exit interview and saying, what were some of the things that you would have loved to see in this class? Or how could this have been structured different? What are some of the creative ideas that you have? Knowing now you are now a knowledge keeper for this class, you've gone through this experience. What would you want to give to the next class, the next generation of learners in this topic? What if we had conversations about curriculum with the people who just went through the curriculum, who are experts on the curriculum? In fact, what they didn't learn is as important as what they did. So what if we asked some of those questions? And also, if you wanted to engage with decolonizing in the classroom, don't go alone. I can't say that enough. I want to say that the indigenous ways of knowing, doing, connecting, and being, and again, we are nations, we are diverse. Pan-indigeneity is not a thing. So like, don't go alone. Don't try and do this by yourself, particularly if you're non-Indigenous and you may not be able to as easily see some of these systems that are predicated on Western ways of knowing, because a fish doesn't know it's wet. This is a part of the marinade that we grew up in. And so if you have the opportunity, create a collective, make it as diverse as possible. Don't go alone, go with community. That's how I approach the decolonization, and never, ever, ever feel like you have to have all of the answers. You just have to start asking the right questions. #education.
That's very helpful. Okay, I think I'll ask one more question, and then I think we'll wrap up for today. But folks, have your email address. We've shared it in the chat box. This last question comes with a gratitude. It starts by saying, interested in the questions you've shared that help center relationality, including thinking about our roles and obligations to our community. Do you have thoughts on how to begin conversations with students, especially in large classes, like, you know those classes, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students in a class, about navigating those different ways of relating in all of the different communities in which they participate or belong? Sorry to stump you with a tough question on the way out here.
No, this is not a tough question. It's one of those simple but like hard things. Like, it's really simple to take out an engine block. It just takes a heck of a lot of energy. So if you want to empower your students to be able to move well and learn well in many different communities, whichever community that they encounter, whether they're particularly if it's not an identity that they have. So if they are wanting to connect with and support the LGBTQ plus community, Indigenous community, community of people with different abilities, any of that, teach your students critical analysis skills. Teach your students how to understand that there are big mechanisms that affect our everyday lives. Teach your students that these systems are set up for some and they are specifically set up to barrier others. Teach your students to see the things that are part of the world and how they affect all of us. Because if you teach your students how to critically analyze this culture, the things that they hear, the media they consume, the communities that they come across in the world, they're going to be better able to work from that place of respect, reciprocity, and relationship. And I don't know any community in which building good relationships, working from reciprocity and respect are not going to take you far. So ask them or provide them the opportunity to see some of these big things in action and provide them with some ways to question the world around them. And if you're able to do that while also bringing in that idea of relationship, reciprocity, and respect, it doesn't matter where they go, you've well equipped your students.
That sounds like an excellent place to close up. I know we have some more comments and questions in the chat, but I'm going to close up partly out of respect for Kita, who I know spent about 45 minutes with us before the session started, trying to deal with her tech issues. It's not just you. We were all. So I'm just imagining that it's probably time for a little bit of a break for you. Kita, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and your knowledge with us. I feel like every time I listen to you, I learn with you in ways that just blow my mind that I never did before. So I will capture the chat because you've got lots of kudos coming in that way. Thank you so much. We appreciate you and all that you bring to this work.
Quick shout out to my cousins. And I also wanted to say thank you to Liz, Helen, and Sarah again, who saw me in full breakdown mode before this happened, where I was like, but the presentation's so pretty, they have to be able to see it. But also to everyone, I wasn't able to keep up with the chat because I couldn't see it and present at the same time, but Sarah's gonna give me the chat. So if you sent me some private messages and you'd like me to connect with you, please throw your email in there and I will see what I can make happen. And thank you so much, everyone. This is, yeah, thank you very much.